The air smelled stale, thick with the damp scent of metal and dust, as Ronan Drax paced the empty expanse of the cold, dimly lit chamber. His boots echoed on the cracked, ancient floor, each step a reminder of the solitude that had become his existence. There were no sounds of life here, no signs of the bustling civilizations he once knew. Only the hum of the ship's dormant systems, barely functional after centuries of disuse, filled the air. Ronan paused at the shattered viewport, his gaze tracing the jagged outline of distant stars through the glass. A dull throb pulsed through his chest, a steady reminder of the rage simmering beneath his stoic exterior. The galaxy had forgotten what humanity was capable of, forgotten what they had seen. The memories clawed at him, like the sharp, twisted branches of a dead tree. He could still hear the screams, the blasts, the deafening silence that had followed. Humanity's vengeance had not been swift, no. It had been calculated, relentless in its brutality, its precision. He could still feel the vibrations in his bones, the tremor of Earth's weapons as they tore through alien fleets, obliterating everything in their path. He had watched it all fall apart, watched Earth's might swallow them whole, and yet the galaxy continued to ignore the warning. With a deep sigh, Ronan turned away from the viewport, the bitterness in his throat thickening as he took in the darkened room. The walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating. He could feel the weight of his years, the burden of having been the lone survivor of that war. His people had underestimated Earth, too. They had dismissed it as a myth, a planet too insignificant to ever pose a threat. Now here he was, one of the last of his kind, a relic of a time when a species thought itself invincible. The harsh screech of his communicator shattered the silence, a desperate pulse breaking through the weight of his thoughts. Ronan's fingers twitched as he reached for the device. His heart raced, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Perhaps someone, somewhere, had finally listened. Maybe the galaxy had come to its senses. "Ronan Drax," a voice crackled through the static, cold and dismissive. "Your request for an audience has been rejected. Again." The words hit him like a slap. He clenched his fists, nails biting into the skin of his palms. The same voice, the same bureaucratic indifference that had met him every single time. It was the same across the galaxy. No one cared. No one would listen. His gaze fell on the datapad in front of him, the glowing map of the galaxy casting an eerie light on his face. He had tried every diplomatic channel, every ally he once had. They had all dismissed him. They laughed at him, mocked him for his warnings. But the signs were there. The signs had always been there, buried beneath the layers of time and ignorance. "Do not provoke them," he whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with the weight of years spent in solitude. "You have no idea what you've done, no idea what you're about to awaken." Ronan moved toward the central console, his fingers dancing across the keys, unlocking access to the ship's ancient archives. The code he had painstakingly deciphered over the years flickered into view. Earth's secrets, humanity's weapons, hidden deep within the confines of the galaxy, waiting to be reactivated. His pulse quickened as the data streamed across the screen. Schematics for warships, weaponry, and an arsenal beyond comprehension. He had uncovered their plans, their strategies, every detail. The fire-breathing Marines, the railguns that could split a planet in two, the ancient technologies that would rip the galaxy apart. And yet, the galaxy's leaders chose to ignore him. There was no time left. Ronan knew that the first signs were already here. The signal he had detected, it had to be Earth. It had to be humanity returning. His fingers hovered over the console, torn between an overwhelming need to act and the fear that nothing he did would make a difference. The galaxy's fate was sealed. The destruction of the galaxy was inevitable, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He rubbed his temples, the metallic scent of the console mingling with the smell of his sweat. His hands were shaking, the coldness of his ship's interior biting into his skin, but he forced himself to focus. He had to finish what he started. If he failed, the consequences would be unimaginable. The door to his quarters creaked open behind him, and Ronan turned, his muscles tensing. A young alien, one of the few who had accompanied him, stood hesitantly in the doorway. His name was Salen, a name that had once been filled with potential. Now it was just another ghost, another pawn in the galaxy's game. The alien's face was drawn, his eyes wide with fear, as though he, too, sensed the looming shadow that was Earth's return. You still think they're coming?" Salen's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking the words out loud would make them real. Ronan's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand. None of you do. Earth will come, and when it does, we won't stand a chance." Salen shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the console and the blinking lights that had brought Ronan to this point. "You want to stop them, don't you? But why? What can we do? We can't fight them. We're already dead." Ronan's lips curled into a bitter smile. He stepped toward the young alien, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You think you can escape it? That hiding will save you? Number, it won't." He paused, his voice growing darker. "You don't have to fight them, but you will witness the cost of your arrogance, and so will the galaxy." Salen's eyes widened, realization dawning on him. He had no more words, no more arguments. He understood now, and his face went pale. Ronan turned back to the console, the cool glow of the screen illuminating his face. He had no illusions left. The galaxy was a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of destruction. The light at the end of the tunnel wasn't salvation. It was the dark embrace of Earth's rage, and they had all but invited it in. The only question left was when it would arrive. The stars outside the viewport seemed to blur together, distant and indifferent. Ronan Drax stood alone as he always had, watching the inevitable unfold. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, a thick blanket pressing down on Ronan Drax's chest as he stared at the darkened console. The last transmission had left him with nothing but the cold, biting realization that his warnings were falling on deaf ears. The voices, the laughter, the dismissive scoffs of the galactic leaders echoed in his mind. They had all written him off as a madman, a relic of a bygone era. But Ronan knew better. The galaxy's arrogance was about to cost them everything, and he was powerless to change their fate. He had warned them over and over, but the galaxy didn't listen. The burning sense of helplessness gnawed at him, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. Ronan turned away from the console, the faint hum of the ship's dying systems the only sound. His boots scraped across the floor, his fingers brushing against the worn metal walls as he moved. His senses were sharp, alert, but they only heightened his frustration. The metallic scent of the room clung to his skin, mingling with the faint traces of ozone from the still-functioning circuits. The faint glow of distant stars flickered beyond the viewport, but it did little to soothe his restless mind. The void outside mirrored his thoughts, empty, infinite, and indifferent. He paced, each step growing heavier, like the weight of the galaxy itself was pressing down on him. How many times had he warned them? How many times had he begged them to listen? The galaxy's leaders were too entrenched in their own pride, too blinded by their assumptions. Earth was nothing more than a footnote in the annals of history to them, a myth, a distant legend. But Ronan knew. He had seen it firsthand. He had felt the fury of Earth's wrath, and now there was nothing left but to watch as the galaxy repeated its mistakes. The door to his quarters opened with a quiet hiss, and a figure stepped inside. It was Salen again, the young alien who had accompanied him on his solitary mission. His steps were cautious, almost hesitant, as if he too could feel the weight of the moment. Salen's features were angular, his skin a deep shade of blue that shimmered faintly in the dim light. His eyes, wide with a mix of fear and curiosity, settled on Ronan as he spoke. "You still think it's coming, don't you?" Salen's voice was barely audible, as if speaking the words out loud would somehow make them more real. His eyes flickered toward the console, the flashing lights that reflected off Ronan's face, but he said nothing more. Ronan's jaw tightened, his hand tightening around the edge of the console. "I don't think it's coming, Salen. I know it is." His voice was low, raw with the frustration of years spent shouting into the void. He turned to face the younger alien, his gaze intense. You don't understand what's at stake. You don't know what they're about to awaken. Saylin's brow furrowed, a flicker of doubt passing through his features. He took a tentative step forward, his voice trembling. But it's just a myth, isn't it? Earth, the warships, all of it? They're just stories, old legends told by survivors. Ronan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Legends, huh? His voice was thick with irony, but beneath it there was an unmistakable edge of pain. I've seen what they're capable of. I've felt it. Earth isn't a story. It's a living nightmare waiting to unfold. Saylin swallowed hard, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to die on his tongue. Ronan could see the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty in his eyes. It was the same expression that every leader had worn when he had pleaded with them. They all thought they were safe. They all thought Earth was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. But Ronan knew better. And now, with each passing day, he could feel the rumblings of Earth's return like the slow building of a storm. The faintest tremor rippled through the ship, a low vibration that reverberated underfoot, unnoticed by most. Ronan's senses sharpened instantly, his body tensing as he froze. He could feel it now, the pulse of something waking, something ancient stirring from its slumber. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of the ship. It was Earth. It was coming. "Did you feel that?" Ronan asked, his voice tense. Saylin blinked, his gaze darting around the room, but he didn't answer. The ship's hum grew louder, a constant background noise, but it wasn't the sound of the ship's systems. It was the sound of something else, something far more dangerous. Ronan's hand shot out toward the console, his fingers flying over the keys. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew he had to check. He had to be sure. The data that flickered across the screen was inconclusive, just a series of scrambled codes, unrecognizable patterns. But there was something there, something faint, a signal. It was weak but unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat as the implications of what he was seeing settled over him. "They've found us," he whispered, more to himself than to Saylin. "They're coming." Saylin's eyes widened, the fear that had been building in his chest now fully realized. "What do we do? What can we do?" Ronan turned toward the young alien, his gaze hardening. "We do nothing. Earth is already on its way. There's no running from it now." The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating. Saylin opened his mouth, his voice barely audible. "But what if we warn them? What if—" "It's too late," Ronan interrupted, his voice sharp and final. "The galaxy had its chance. Now they'll pay for their ignorance." Saylin stood there, silent, as the weight of Ronan's words settled in. The young alien had been raised to believe in the might of the galaxy, to trust in the power of technology and diplomacy. He had been taught that nothing could challenge their dominance, nothing could threaten their peace. But in this moment, Saylin was learning a hard truth, that peace was a fragile illusion. The ship groaned beneath them, a sharp, groaning noise that seemed to reverberate deep within the hull. Ronan's mind raced. There wasn't much time left. He had to find a way to activate the warships, to awaken Earth's ancient power before it was too late. The galaxy would never be ready for what was coming. As he turned to leave the room, Saylin's voice stopped him. "Ronan, what if we're wrong? What if this is just nothing?" Ronan's hand tightened on the doorframe, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to face the young alien. His words were low, tinged with the weight of years of pain and regret. "If we're wrong, then I will spend the rest of my life making sure the galaxy knows it. But if I'm right—" He let the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. With that, Ronan stepped into the corridor, the sound of his boots echoing through the metal halls, as Saylin stood in the silence of the room, contemplating the truth that had just been revealed. Ronan stood at the edge of the control room, the hum of the ship's ancient systems vibrating through his bones. The dim lights flickered erratically above him, casting long shadows against the worn metal walls. The ship, though dormant for centuries, had finally begun to stir, like an old beast awakening from a deep slumber. Every whir of the old machinery felt like a promise a whisper from the past that Earth was returning. But as the ship's forgotten systems roared to life, Ronan knew that it wasn't just a return, it was a reckoning. The air was thick with the scent of machinery, tinged with the faintest whiff of something older, something he couldn't place, but it reminded him of the smell of damp forests back on Earth. His skin prickled with anticipation as he moved toward the central console, the cold touch of metal seeping through his gloves. The screen flickered, displaying the fragmented blueprints he had unearthed weeks ago. And with each passing second, the activation codes began to fall into place like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. But even as the system began to respond, a gnawing sense of unease tightened around his chest. "Activate them," he whispered, as though the words alone could unlock the full fury of Earth's lost arsenal. His heart raced as the console hummed louder, a low, ominous sound vibrating through the floor. The controls, which had once been as familiar to him as his own skin, now felt alien and distant. Yet somewhere deep within the ship's heart, the dormant warships waited. The fire-breathing space marines, the railguns capable of splitting planets, the might of humanity, lost in time but not forgotten. Ronan's hands trembled as he punched in the final set of coordinates. The screen blinked, then stilled, the cold blue glow bathing his face in its eerie light. And then, nothing. The ship's hum faltered for a split second, a brief, unnatural silence that sent a jolt of panic through him. Was it too late? Had the ancient systems failed? A low rumble shook the deck, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from the very core of the ship. Ronan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't failure. It was the beginning. A slow, deliberate hum of machinery in motion, one that carried with it the weight of Earth's forgotten wrath. The console screen flickered again, and the map of Earth's warships materialized before him. The coordinates he had unlocked were confirmed. The ships were awakening. Slowly, methodically, the systems began to align, and Ronan knew that the nightmare he had been fearing was no longer a distant shadow. It was real. It was happening. "Do you hear it?" Salon's voice cut through the tension, soft and uncertain. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim, flickering light from the corridor. His eyes were wide and his body tensed as if he, too, felt the pulse of something waking. Ronan didn't answer immediately. His focus remained fixed on the screen as the ship's systems continued to activate. But there was a shift in the air, something palpable that filled the room with an unease so heavy it almost seemed to press against his lungs. He didn't need to answer Salon. The young alien had felt it too. "I've seen the signs, Salon. Earth is waking up." Ronan's voice was steady, but inside, his thoughts churned. He had spent years piecing together this moment, and now that it was here, it felt more like a curse than a revelation. Salon stepped closer, his footsteps tentative. "You said it would happen. But what if we can't stop it? What if this time there's no going back?" Ronan's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "There's no stopping it. The galaxy made its choice." His eyes flicked to the console once more, where Earth's ancient weapons were beginning to take shape. And now Earth's wrath will be felt. There's no hiding from it. Salon shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder at the ship's darkened corridors, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. What happens next? Ronan didn't respond at first, letting the silence stretch between them, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. The truth was, Ronan wasn't entirely sure. He had the codes, the knowledge, but what he lacked was time. The galaxy was blind to what was coming, and even now, as the ship began to hum with life, Ronan's heart raced with the knowledge that he was just a single man against the indifference of an entire universe. But Earth was more than just technology. It was humanity's relentless ingenuity, its adaptability that had allowed it to survive in the most unforgiving of environments. And if the galaxy thought it could defeat Earth by mere numbers and military might, they were gravely mistaken. Earth had never needed to play by the rules. It made its own. "Prepare yourself, Salon," Ronan said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "What happens next is beyond our control, but we must be ready. When the signal comes, we must act." Salen looked at him, the fear in his eyes mingling with a sense of curiosity. He wanted to understand, to grasp the magnitude of the situation. But Ronan knew that there were some things that couldn't be explained, things that could only be experienced. And this was one of them. The ship shuddered again, this time with more force, as though it were stretching its limbs after centuries of slumber. Ronan's gaze snapped back to the console. The system was reaching its final stages. The warships were almost fully activated. The signal was intensifying, a faint pulse that was growing stronger by the second, a signal that would mark the beginning of humanity's return to the galaxy. And then a new display flashed across the screen, a map of the galaxy, with Earth's location highlighted in bright red. The coordinates were fixed, pinpointed with terrifying precision. Ronan's breath caught in his throat. The signal was no longer just a signal. It was a beacon, a call that would draw the attention of every civilization in the galaxy. "Prepare for impact," Ronan muttered under his breath. But even as the words left his lips, he knew it was already too late. The galaxy would soon learn the truth, and by then, it would be far beyond any of their control. Salen stepped back, his eyes darting around the room as if he could sense the tension building in the very walls of the ship. The cold, metallic scent of the air seemed to thicken, and Ronan could feel it too, the tightening, the pressure that always came just before a battle. As the final systems flickered to life, the ship's engines roared, sending a deep vibration through the floor beneath their feet. The door to the corridor slammed shut, a final deafening thud that echoed through the chamber. The lights above them flickered and then steadied. The ship was awake. Ronan's mind raced as the reality of the situation set in. The warships were activated, and Earth's message was clear. The galaxy had a choice: acknowledge the power they had long ignored, or face the consequences of their ignorance. Ronan clenched his fists, knowing that the next move was no longer his. It was up to Earth. And when the first blast from Earth's weaponry tore through the silence, the galaxy would never be the same again. The ship groaned as its engines roared to life, sending a hum of power surging through Ronan's bones. He felt it like a tremor in his chest, a low, guttural pulse that matched the rhythm of his racing heartbeat. The air around him seemed to thicken, almost alive with the weight of what was unfolding. The faint, acrid tang of ozone lingered in his nostrils, mixing with the sharp scent of burning circuitry. Ronan's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the console, his fingers brushing against the cold metal surface. He stared at the screen in front of him, watching as Earth's warships began to awaken, each flicker of the data more real than the last. The faint red outline of Earth blinked across the map, pulsating like a warning signal, urging him to act. But it was already too late. Beside him, Salen stood in stunned silence, his wide eyes fixed on the same screen. His body was taut, every muscle coiled in anticipation, as the ship's systems began to respond with mechanical precision. The air felt charged, like static electricity before a storm, each passing second bringing them closer to an inevitable clash. The ship's systems were no longer just powering up. They were preparing for war. The flickering blueprints on the console, the intricate designs of railguns and black ships, had gone from mere images to tangible threats. Earth's forgotten arsenal was being reawakened, and the galaxy was about to feel its fury. Ronan's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over each other like a torrent. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt like a ghostly premonition, a terrible truth that would soon be laid bare. The galaxy had been warned, but they had refused to listen. They had laughed at Earth's power, dismissed it as a myth, and now they would pay the price for their arrogance. Salen's voice broke the stillness, low and shaky. "Ronan, what happens now?" Ronan didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, watching the activation codes flicker one by one, the ship's systems gradually falling into place. He could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the hum of the dormant technology coming to life like an ancient creature stretching after a long sleep. The intensity of it was overwhelming, and for a brief moment he wondered if it might consume them all. But there was no turning back now. This was the path they had chosen. He exhaled sharply, his breath ragged in the still air. "We wait. Earth is coming, and when it arrives—" He trailed off, the words too heavy to finish. Saylan's eyes flickered toward the screen. His lips parted as though he were about to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he merely nodded, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the enormity of what lay ahead. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the smell of old machinery and decay. The temperature seemed to drop, a stark contrast to the heat that pulsed through Ronan's veins. He felt the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The ship's engines thrummed beneath him, but it wasn't the usual hum of a ship in motion. It was something deeper, something darker, as though the very core of the vessel had awakened to the ancient purpose it had been built for, and that purpose was war. The seconds felt like hours, stretching endlessly in the tense silence. Ronan's hands hovered over the console, unwilling to make the final command. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant, drawn into the machinery of this ancient power that had long been dormant. The hum in the air grew louder, almost unbearable, as the warships slowly powered up, their systems coming online one by one. It wasn't just the ships that were awakening, Ronan realized. Earth's weapons were stirring as well. The fire-breathing Marines, the railguns, the shockwaves that would ripple through the galaxy, destroying everything in their path. It was a power unlike any the galaxy had ever known. "Are we ready?" Saylan's voice was barely audible, the words hanging in the air like fragile threads. The young alien's eyes were wide with disbelief, his body tense, as though he could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. Ronan finally tore his gaze away from the screen, locking eyes with Saylan. The gravity of the moment settled over him, and for the first time, he felt the weight of everything, the loss, the struggle, the years spent in isolation, all culminating in this single moment. "We're not ready," Ronan said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "But Earth doesn't care about readiness. It never has. It's here," Saylan muttered, his voice trembling with awe and fear. The young alien stood rigid beside him, eyes wide with the overwhelming sight of the eruption outside. The shockwave from the blast seemed to ripple outward, a pulse of energy that distorted the stars themselves, sending ripples through space. Ronan could feel the vibrations in his chest, the force of the impact reverberating through his bones. The galaxy had never seen anything like this. Earth's wrath had arrived. Ronan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the distant star explode into a brilliant, violent flare. The galaxy was watching. They were waiting for an enemy they couldn't fathom. But it was already too late. He could hear Saylan's shallow breaths beside him, could feel the young alien's presence like a weight in the room. The fear was palpable now, settling in the air like dust, and Ronan knew that Saylan, like the rest of the galaxy, was beginning to understand just how grave the situation had become. The galaxy had laughed at Earth. The myth of its power had been a joke to them. But now, the joke was over. Ronan didn't speak. There were no words left for explanations. No more pleas for understanding. The galaxy would know soon enough. The signal they had received, Earth's first strike, had been the beginning. What followed would be inevitable. Humanity's return would be swift, and it would be unrelenting. The console flickered as the next wave of warships appeared on the screen. Earth's fleet was a force of nature, a tidal wave of unstoppable might, ready to engulf the galaxy in a flood of fire and iron. The ships stretched across the screen like the long, dark shadows of an ancient predator, waiting to pounce. Ronan's fingers hovered over the controls, knowing that the timing was crucial. Each move had to be calculated. He had to be precise. "Do you see them?" Saylan asked, his voice strained. The young alien was still staring out into the blackness of space, his face illuminated by the glow of the console, his expression one of shock and disbelief. "I see them," Ronan replied, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "And soon they will see us." Saylan's gaze flickered toward Ronan, a mixture of fear and confusion clouding his eyes. He opened his mouth, but Ronan didn't give him a chance to speak. The words were meaningless now, washed away by the unrelenting force of what Earth was about to unleash. A deep rumbling sound vibrated through the ship once more, followed by a blinding flash of light. Ronan felt it in his chest, like an impact that left his ribs bruised, his heartbeat quickening with every pulse. Earth's second strike had hit, and this time it was larger. The ship's systems groaned, lights flickering above them, casting long shadows across the room. The reverberations shook them to their core, and Ronan could feel every inch of the ship as if it were an extension of his own body. The silence that followed was deafening. Sallin shifted uneasily, his breath shallow. The screens flickered to life again, but this time Ronan noticed something new. The galactic map had changed. Earth's warships were no longer just dots on a map. They were moving, converging, taking their places in the galaxy's vast expanse. Ronan's mind worked furiously, trying to keep up with the barrage of information. The galaxy was beginning to wake up. Soon, they would understand the magnitude of the power Earth had hidden away for centuries. Ronan's heart pounded as he keyed in the activation sequence for the next wave. Each movement, each command he gave, brought him closer to the moment when humanity's anger would spill across the galaxy. The first wave of fire-breathing Marines would make their mark. The railguns would strike like the fists of a god, cracking planets open like fragile eggs. Sallin was speaking again, but Ronan didn't hear him. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the terrifying clarity of the task ahead. The galaxy would no longer be the masters of their own fate. Earth had returned, and the galaxy's ignorance would be punished. There was no other choice. A distant rumble echoed, but it wasn't just from the ship. It came from somewhere deep in the galaxy, a shuddering shockwave that rattled the stars themselves. Ronan's eyes snapped to the console. The map was changing once again. Earth's warships were making their way toward the heart of the galaxy, and there was no stopping them now. The soft whir of machinery filled the room, a low, steady hum that had become the soundtrack of Ronan's every waking moment. The ship's controls responded to his every movement, the ancient systems clicking into place with a fluidity that defied their age. It was as though the ship, like the weapons it carried, was alive once more, awake and aware, ready to fulfill its purpose. Sallin's voice broke through the tension again. "Ronan, what if they fight back?" Ronan looked up, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "They will fight back, but they won't win." The finality in his voice silenced Sallin. The young alien understood, but the weight of it pressed heavily on him. There was no room for doubt, no time for second-guessing. Earth's might was unmatched, and soon the galaxy would learn that the stories of humanity's wrath were not just legends. They were prophecies, dark and unyielding. The next shockwave struck with devastating force, sending a ripple through the ship once more. The console began to flash with warning signs, but Ronan didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. He had seen this moment unfold in his mind 1,000 times. And now that it was here, there was no fear, only resolve. He moved with purpose, his fingers dancing over the console, feeding the ship with the final commands. The countdown began. He could hear the hum of energy building, the vibration in the air growing stronger. The galaxy would never be the same again. And as the first wave of humanity's firepower shot across the stars, a single thought ran through Ronan's mind. The galaxy had made its choice. Now Earth would show them the price of ignorance, the price of arrogance. A massive flash of light erupted outside the ship, and for a moment, all that existed in the universe was the blinding, scorching fury of Earth's weapons. The galaxy had been warned. Now, the real war had begun. The violent tremors that had rocked the ship began to subside, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Ronan could feel the weight of it pressing in, the oppressive stillness filling the space with a heavy finality. His fingers hovered above the console, the intensity of the moment crystallizing in his chest, the rush of power from Earth's weaponry still reverberating in his veins. The bright flash from outside the viewport had faded, leaving only the blackness of space. The stars, once distant and silent, now felt like witnesses to the brutal shift in the galaxy's fate. Selene stood beside him, his body rigid, his eyes wide with disbelief. The young alien was silent, the weight of what had just happened sinking in slowly. Earth had struck, and it was far more devastating than anything the galaxy had imagined. The first wave of fire-breathing Marines had launched, sweeping through the void with terrifying precision, and the railguns, powerful enough to tear a planet in half, had already left their mark. Ronan could feel the shift in the air, a current of fear, as though the very fabric of space was holding its breath. They didn't fight back," Salen whispered, almost as if to himself. Ronan's gaze never wavered from the screen. The galactic map had changed again, Earth's warships now moving like sharks through the water, their path deliberate and unyielding. The galaxy's leaders, scattered across the stars, had begun to react, but it was too late. The first blow had landed, and there was no room for negotiation now. Earth had sent its message, loud and clear. There was no more talk of myths, no more dismissals of Earth's power. The faint glow from the control panel cast harsh shadows across Ronan's face, the lines of weariness and regret etched deeper than ever. He had known this moment was coming, but seeing it unfold, feeling the raw power of Earth's arsenal unleashed, was something he hadn't fully prepared for. His mind was racing, calculating the next steps. The galaxy's response would be swift, there was no doubt about that. But what would it be? Would they continue to underestimate Earth's might, or would they finally acknowledge the gravity of the situation? "Ronan!" Salen's voice trembled, pulling him out of his thoughts. What now? What happens next? Ronan turned to face the young alien, his expression unreadable. Salen's face was pale, his breath shallow, as though the magnitude of what had just occurred was too much to comprehend. Ronan felt a fleeting moment of pity, but it passed quickly. There was no time for hesitation, no time for fear. "What happens next?" Ronan echoed, his voice low and steady. "We wait." We let them feel the weight of Earth's return. Salen's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. "Wait for what? More destruction?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. His eyes shifted back to the map, where Earth's warships were steadily advancing. It wasn't just destruction they would feel. It was the crushing weight of Earth's vengeance, its return to the stars, not as a survivor, but as a conqueror. The galaxy had long forgotten Earth's potential, and now it would pay the price. But there was more at stake than just the warships. The real power lay in the forbidden technology Ronan had uncovered, the AI-driven systems that made Earth's machines so deadly, so precise. Earth had always been underestimated, but this time, the galaxy would learn just how deeply they had misjudged it. Ronan didn't respond. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Earth's next move would be decisive. The warships were ready, the weapons were prepared, and soon the galaxy would know what Earth's vengeance truly looked like. As the ship vibrated again, this time with a sharp, bone-rattling intensity, Ronan knew that the next battle would not be fought with words. It would be fought with fire, with force, with the raw, unyielding power that humanity had once wielded with such precision. And this time, there would be no escape. The galaxy had made its mistake. Now it would feel the full weight of Earth's retribution. Ronan's eyes flicked to the console once more, watching as the map of the galaxy pulsed with life. The dark, menacing outlines of Earth's warships now loomed like a storm ready to break across the sky. A cold, harsh tremor ran through the ship as it adjusted its trajectory, aligning with the coordinates that would bring them closer to the heart of the galaxy. Earth had arrived. It wasn't a matter of whether the galaxy would fight back anymore. It was a question of how long it would last before it was ground into nothingness beneath humanity's heel. Salen stood at his side, but Ronan knew that the young alien was no longer just an observer. He had seen too much now, understood the magnitude of what had been unleashed. The arrogance of the galaxy was about to be shattered, and there was no escaping the consequences of their ignorance. Earth wasn't just fighting for survival this time. It was fighting for dominance, for a place in the stars that had been denied for far too long. Ronan couldn't afford to waste time. He could already hear the rumblings of distant fleets, those galaxies' strongest forces coming together in a futile, desperate bid to prevent Earth's vengeance. The lights above them flickered once again, casting sharp shadows across the control room. A low hum filled the air as the ship's systems continued to adapt, every circuit firing to life in perfect synchronization. Ronan's breath came in steady, measured inhales, his mind racing through the tactical blueprint that had been forming for years. This wasn't just about overwhelming strength. It was about precision, about making every strike count. The warships, though powerful, weren't invincible. Humanity's advantage lay in its ability to adapt, to strike with calculated intent. And that's what Ronan would make sure of. Earth's attacks would be surgical, devastating, and utterly unrelenting. He turned to the console again, fingers poised above the keypad as he began inputting the final commands. He wasn't alone in his thoughts. He could feel Saylin's unease beside him, the young alien's anxious breath barely perceptible against the backdrop of machinery. Saylin had been part of this journey, part of the awakening of Earth's forgotten might, but he had never seen anything like what was about to unfold. He had been introduced to the power, but not yet to its consequences. Ronan's pulse quickened as the plan began to take shape. Saylin, for the first time, would understand why the galaxy's resistance would be futile. "The first strike will come from the railguns," Ronan muttered under his breath, as much to himself as to Saylin. "We'll target their largest fleet. Those are the ones most likely to try and regroup. We'll make them scatter. They won't know where to hit us next." Saylin's gaze was fixed on the screen, his eyes still wide with a mix of awe and dread. And then what? The question was faint, tremulous, but it held a quiet desperation. What's the next step? Ronan glanced over, his jaw set, his eyes narrowing as he pressed a sequence of keys, the map expanding. "We'll give them a false sense of victory. Let them think they've gained ground, but only for a moment. Once they adjust their fleet, we'll drop the secondary wave." His hand hovered over the key that would activate the next phase. "This will be their undoing." Saylin didn't speak, but Ronan could sense his silent calculation. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was the best chance they had. Earth's fleets were built on surprise, on strategies that no one had ever expected to see in the galaxy. The advantage was with humanity because they weren't constrained by the norms the galaxy had established. Ronan's voice was steady, his mind sharpened by years of planning, but deep inside, he knew that no matter how carefully they executed this, the fallout would be catastrophic. The weight of it settled into his bones. There was no turning back now. "Ready the secondary fleet," Ronan instructed, watching as Saylin keyed in the next set of commands. The young alien worked quickly, but Ronan noticed the tremble in his hands, a subtle sign of the tension he carried. They both felt it, the anticipation, the fear, the inevitability of what was to come. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a war for the future of the galaxy, a war that would rewrite everything. The secondary wave, unlike the first, would be the real test. Earth's warships would unleash hell upon the galaxy, not in a single, overwhelming strike, but in a series of calculated attacks designed to hit their enemies where they were weakest. The railguns would create shockwaves that would fracture the enemy's fleet into disarray. The fire-breathing Marines would be unleashed to sweep through enemy lines, tearing apart any forces that stood in their way. Earth wasn't playing for a single victory. It was playing for dominance, for the ability to carve out its place in the galaxy once and for all. The silence between them was almost unbearable, the sound of the ship's systems, the only thing filling the air. Ronan glanced at the readouts. The first fleet was already on course. Earth's warships were advancing, their weapons primed and ready. He could feel the tension building, the world around them holding its breath as Earth prepared for its first real strike. "They're closing in," Saylin said, his voice almost distant, but with a quiet urgency. "The galaxy will be watching. The fleets are already moving." Ronan's gaze never left the console. He took a slow, deliberate breath. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when Earth's fury is unleashed. He pressed a series of keys, activating the next phase of the plan. The ship's engines responded immediately, a deep vibration that resonated beneath their feet, shaking them both to their core. Salen looked up sharply, his breath catching in his throat. "Is it time?" Ronan nodded. "It's time." The tension in the room was electric, the air thick with anticipation. Through the viewport, the first light of the battle began to take shape, distant flashes marking the beginning of the war. Ronan felt the weight of each decision he had made, each move they had planned, bearing down on him like an unyielding force. This was Earth's moment, not just a moment of vengeance, but of reclamation. The warships moved with terrifying precision, each strike calculated, each step planned down to the smallest detail. And as the first shockwave of Earth's firepower raked across the galaxy's defenses, Ronan stood firm, his mind clear, his body tense. The first blow had been struck. The galaxy had been warned, but it would take more than this to end the fight. Now, the battle for the galaxy had truly begun, and Earth would not stop until its place was secured. The ship's hull groaned in protest as Ronan watched the next wave of Earth's warships emerge from the dark void of space, their cold, unfeeling silhouette cutting through the expanse. The eerie hum of their engines reverberated through the ship, a deep, resonant sound that made his bones ache. Every fiber of the ship, every weapon, every strategy that had been set into motion now converged on the final moment, the last, decisive battle. The first shockwaves of Earth's wrath had already shaken the galaxy to its core, and now Ronan could feel it, the inevitable collapse of everything the galaxy had known. The universe, once dominated by proud civilizations, now stood on the brink of realizing how wrong they had been about humanity. Salen stood beside him, his stance rigid, his face ashen under the flickering lights of the console. The young alien had watched Earth's forces decimate the galaxy's elite fleets with ruthless efficiency. He had felt the destructive power of Earth's war machines firsthand. He knew what was coming next, but the gravity of it still seemed too much to bear. "Their fleets are in disarray," Salen said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "We've crippled their lines. They can't hold out much longer." Ronan's gaze never wavered from the map on the screen. Earth's strategy had been flawless, not because of its strength, but because of its sheer unpredictability. The galaxy had been given a chance to stop Earth, to acknowledge the threat, and it had ignored it. Now, Earth's wrath wasn't a simple retaliation. It was a revolution, an uprising that would change everything. "Let them try to fight," Ronan muttered under his breath, his voice sharp as the edge of a blade. "We gave them their chance. Now, we'll show them what happens when you underestimate humanity's resolve." The console in front of them flashed red, a series of urgent beeps filling the room. Ronan's fingers moved with practiced precision, locking in the final coordinates. The ships, poised and ready, would strike with a force that would leave nothing but ashes in their wake. The warships, Earth's finest creations, would pierce through the galaxy's defenses like a knife through paper. Humanity's superiority was no longer just an idea. It was an undeniable truth. It was a reality the galaxy would soon have no choice but to face. As the final coordinates locked into place, Ronan's breath slowed. He turned to Salen, the weight of what he was about to say hanging heavily in the air. "You were right about one thing, Salen," Ronan said, his voice cold but tinged with a strange, almost regretful calm. "They did fight back. But they fought with their arrogance, their belief that they could control everything. The galaxy's pride blinded them to the truth. "It's over," Ronan finally said, his voice steady but with a depth of emotion that betrayed the years of struggle. "We've proven them wrong. Humanity's wrath was never a myth. It was a truth they weren't ready to accept." As the final waves of Earth's weapons hit their targets, the light outside the viewport dimmed. The galaxy, once so vast and proud, was now in ruins, its fleets scattered across the stars, its leaders cowering in the shadows. Earth had returned, and the universe would never be the same again. Ronan looked at Salen, the young alien who had once believed in the superiority of the galaxy. "Now they know," he said, his voice a soft whisper. "Now they know that humanity is no longer a footnote in history. We are the authors of our future. And with that, the final echo of Earth's wrath reverberated across the galaxy, a testament to humanity's enduring strength, to its rise from the ashes, and to the truth that had finally been made clear to all. Humanity had come, and the galaxy would bow before it.